In this video, we're going to take a look at the span panel. Now, specifically the span panel main 32 is what I installed in my house. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that panel specifically, but I'm also going to talk about some of the other panels and some things that I didn't necessarily know at the time. And I'm also going to talk about what considerations I had when I got the span panel and what other products I might have looked at. That way you've got a good understanding of what the difference is between the span panel and say the Leviton smart panel or the Schneider panel or the EcoFlow. I'm going to talk a little bit about all of those panels and what the differences are, what are some of the considerations you might want to be aware of when you're looking at upgrading to a smart panel for your house. But to start, let's go ahead and take a look at the span panel 32 so we can get familiar with the options that that panel has. So the first thing we need to talk about is all the options that span has. So you've got the main lug only 48. So if you need a lot of different breaker options, that's a great one there. I'm actually looking at getting the span panel main 40 as an upgrade to my current span panel 32. So that might be something down the road. I might record a video actually walking through the entire install of that process, but then putting the span panel 32 as potentially a sub panel under the main 40. And the reason being is I've already kind of filled up this entire panel here. And if you do that, you don't necessarily get circuit level monitoring. So I could add more tandem switches, but then my ability to see the individual spaces gets a little bit more complicated because there's a lot of stuff on each of these breakers. And when you put it on a tandem, that's a lot more potential for energy use that you don't necessarily get that granular insight into what's going on for your energy usage that you would if you just got more spaces through upgrading your panel or getting a bigger panel. But they do have these different options here. So if you don't need as many breaker spaces, maybe you have a 100 amp service, so maybe you could be fine with a main 16. But these are your panel options that Span currently has. Now for years, the only option they had was the span panel main 32. At the time that I bought mine, that was the only option they had. Otherwise, I would have probably got the main 40 just to have the extra spaces. I knew that I wanted the main 40. The problem was I wanted to get the solar done, and I wanted to do the solar and the panel at the same time. I had an original panel in my house from the 70s, and I felt it was important to get a beefier panel, newer panel to support the newer loads that these houses have. So it wasn't practical for me to wait, unfortunately. Otherwise, I could have waited the 3 to 4 months. But even then, the 3 to 4 months was when it was available. You couldn't necessarily get it right away. So I probably would have waited another 6 months before actually getting the main 40. I really wasn't willing to wait. So unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I'm probably going to get this panel and then I'll just have this sub, which means that I will never have to use tandems because that is a lot of spaces. But if we take a look at other options, they've also got a span drive here. Now, this is for EVs. Now, I do plan on getting an EV. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to use this charger or a different one. I really want to have an 80 amp charger. So that's one of the considerations I'm looking at for a charger. And I did reach out to Span and I suggested that they try to do an 80 amp because a lot of vehicles, especially with the bigger battery packs, allow for 80 amps. But then more importantly is they could always create it so that you could have multiple EV chargers running on the same breaker. And that's what I would like to do is have an 80 amp, but then also have a 48 amp or, some smaller one that Span offers that pairs with that 80 amp. So all I have to have is a 100 amp breaker using that 80 amp charger. And then if I've got two EVs charging, it would share that one breaker instead of having to use more breaker spaces. Now, like I said, I'm going to have plenty of breaker spaces. I could probably do that, but adding two EV chargers to 200 amp service, I am getting a little bit to the top end of what my 200 amp panel can support, given some of the other upgrades that I've made in the house and some of the things I was thinking about doing in the future. So I don't necessarily want to have that much dedicated towards EV chargers. It's a lot better, in my opinion, to have an 80 amp or 100 amp breaker with an 80 amp charger and then sharing that with another charger. 80 amps, in my opinion, is plenty for two vehicles. I don't know that you need 48 amps for each. Granted, you would charge both equally as fast if you had both of them plugging in there. But I tend to think that 80 amps is probably sufficient. So you're talking 40 amps for each vehicle, assuming that you've got two plugged in there. So that's kind of my thought process for the span drive. And then you've got the Span Edge, which is also a new item and essentially like their collar upgrade. So it's kind of the same thing. Again, this is all new hardware, wasn't available when I did the span panel 32. So if we come back to the span panel 32 and let's focus specifically on what we have with this panel. Now, if you get the span panel 32, the biggest thing to be aware of, obviously you've got less breakers than say the 40, but if we scroll down here, you've got 32 controllable spaces, which again span 32. You essentially have 2 circuits per breaker with tandems that you can use. So essentially you've got 64 spaces that you can kind of use with this. But the key thing to be aware of is this 90 amp max branch circuit. So you can't throw a 100 amp breaker in this and have that work. And this actually turned out to be kind of an issue for my house, where the amount of solar that I was installing exceeded the 90 amp breaker. So for landing solar in my panel, I had to land it on the main lugs instead of a breaker. So I lost some capabilities as far as what the span panel would allow you to do because of that. Normally when you install solar, you would assign the solar to a breaker space in here. And again, I didn't have a lot of breaker spaces either, so that was problematic to begin with. But I could have done the tandems. But my solar actually exceeds 90 amps. I would need a 100 amp breaker in order to land my solar on the panel itself. So that was something I considered as part of this. The problem is that none of the other options out there had a good option for this either. Now, I would say for the new panels, they do support up to 100 amps, and we'll look at that in here in just a second to see that. For the most part, though, the panels are almost identical in every other way. Now, another thing that's a big difference between the span panel 32 and some of these other ones, your installer will hate installing this panel. They'll love the technology and the idea behind it, but they will not like installing the 32. There's not a lot of space for them to work. This is something they've fixed in some of the bigger panels. They've got more room for working both on the sides and above and below. And additionally, there aren't any knockouts on the 32, and I don't believe they've corrected that as part of that. If you've got a newer panel and it does have knockouts, feel free to leave a comment on there identifying that. But my understanding was that they did not fix that yet with the span panel 32. And what did that translate to for my installers was a lot of hole drill bits. I think they went through 3 drilling through this. The metal on this case is pretty heavy duty. They went through a couple of different drill bits in the process of actually drilling out these holes. So that was a lot of work for them to install this. Some of the other things that are different between the span panel 32 and some of these other options is you have the ability to remove the actual computer from this thing. So if we scroll up here, all of this can be removed. So you've just got the case to work with. And I tend to think that's a really good upgrade for this. It makes it a little bit lighter when they're actually mounting it to the wall. Plus, one of the concerns I had with the way that this was initially set up was they're drilling all these holes, and all these shavings from the drill bits were landing right back into the case. So we did a lot of vacuuming to get some of that stuff out of there. Now, potentially you'll still have to deal with a little bit of that as you drill holes and add things in the future, but you don't want a lot of metal shavings, obviously, around your electrical equipment. That is something to be concerned about. Now, again, in the upgraded panels, they do have knockouts, so you won't have to necessarily drill as much. But really, that's the biggest difference between the different options that span provides. Now, I mentioned comparing other options at the time of my purchase, which is about a year and a half ago. There weren't as many options then as there are now. A lot of the different companies out there are starting to pay attention to what span was doing and are coming out with options. Now, the one option that was there was Leviton, and this is the one that I focused a lot on when I was deciding whether to get a span panel or some other option. I'll talk a little bit about the other options, but this really was the only panel that I was considering at the time was the Leviton. Now, there's a big difference in the technology between Leviton and span. Span focuses on having a computer, and then you can use a Siemens, a Square D, or an Eaton breaker on top of that computer. So you don't need smart breakers. Leviton focuses on smart breakers. So you can essentially have a Leviton panel that costs you a couple $100 to get, and then you pay for all of the smart breakers. And you don't necessarily have to have a smart breaker on every single breaker. You can pick and choose between regular breakers and the smart breakers. So it's a little bit more flexible in that regard. But if you're looking for whole home, you want to know every single breaker, you're going to need to have every single breaker in your Leviton panel be a smart breaker to achieve that. I said that the actual panel is only a couple $100 and they have between 42 spaces and 66 spaces. So you've got a little bit of flexibility there on the number of spaces that you can, way more than you have currently with the span. But if you're trying to do the entire panel, you need to look at the cost of all these breakers. And if we look at the cost, you can see that they are not cheap. So you might be able to get the actual enclosure for the panel for a couple $100, but you're going to spend several $100s for each of these breakers that you're going to install in the panel. So these are not cheap breakers. You're looking at around $100 is kind of the standard for these Leviton smart breakers. Now, the other thing to be aware of is that there isn't anything larger than a 60 amp breaker available for the Leviton smart breakers. So if you are fine with that, you're never going to have the possibility of having an 80 amp EV charger. You're fine with that, then this will work great for you. I knew that I was looking at potentially getting an 80 amp EV charger, so this was kind of an issue I had to consider is, am I okay using a standard breaker for that 100 amp, or do I want to have the ability to monitor what's going on across every single breaker? And in my case, I decided that I wanted to be able to monitor everything. Now, that's not to say that Leviton won't eventually come out with greater than 60 amp smart breakers, but right now, and really for the last couple of years, they have not had anything larger than 60 amp breakers, and there's no actual discussion about having larger ones at this time, at least that I could find looking at different forums and reaching out and asking questions. So that is something to be aware of, is you are limited to 60 amp smart breakers. Now, I also mentioned talking about some of the other options that are out there. Now, in terms of cost, the EcoFlow is pretty affordable. $15.99 is not bad. You're going to pay 2 to 3 times more than that for the span panel itself. The Leviton, as we just took a look at, depending on how many smart breakers you get, might exceed this, or you might actually get it lower depending, again, what you want to actually monitor with the panel itself. But the problem with the EcoFlow, in my perspective, is you are kind of tied to the system. So if you're going to do EcoFlow batteries for your house, and you know that that's the only thing you're ever going to use, this is a great option. But if you're looking for a more flexible option, the Span or the Leviton would be much better choices for you. Now, for my install, I wasn't sure exactly which battery I was going to go with for my solar and battery system. I was pretty nailed down on the solar. I picked out the solar installer, but in my area, we actually have net metering 1-for-1. So it didn't make a lot of sense at the time to get battery. I knew I wanted to get battery, but I didn't necessarily need it at the particular install point. So that gave me a little bit of time to kind of consider what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to have a Tesla, period. Full stop. Didn't want to have anything to do with Tesla. Their customer service is unpredictable at best. Worse is generally what I hear from most people, is it's just really, really bad. Part of it is I think they've got too many people trying to do Tesla Powerwalls and not enough installers, not enough tech support, not enough customer service to support the number of people, or it's just their philosophy to have horrible customer service. I'm not sure what it is, but I knew I didn't want to have a Tesla Powerwall 3. I really, really like the Franklin product, but again, at the same time that I was having this problem of they don't have the span panel, they'd already announced the next span panel and it was coming, it kept getting delayed. The same thing was happening with Franklin, which I really, really liked the Franklin A-Powers, but the A-Power 2, again, wasn't actually going to happen until the next year. And I really wanted to get this done as part of the federal tax credits, and I wanted to get it done as part of that particular year so that I could get that credit back within a couple months and then reapply to other things or pay off the loan. And I was going to have that problem where it was not necessarily going to happen on the time schedule that it needed to be in order to claim that credit. Now, the other problem with the Franklin A-Powers or the Teslas is I don't have a lot of wall space, and you need wall space in order to have these products. I have plenty of floor space, especially in my basement. Here's the basement, and you can see it's pretty full. So there's not any space on the wall for anything. Here's our span main panel here. And I'm looking at maybe getting a second span panel. That would probably take that space right there. And then where I was thinking the batteries would go is right over here. So I would take this section down here, and that would be the stack of batteries right there in that space. But there really isn't space in the basement for batteries. But nowhere on my house, whether the basement, the garage, or on the sidewall of the house where the meter is, did I have a lot of room for power. And I knew that I wanted to have a lot of battery power. Anywhere from 40 to 120 kilowatt hours was kind of the goal of what I was looking for, which for me, that would be essentially an entire wall of my house would be these battery cells. So I had a problem with what options I had, and these are the only options for the span. So if you want to use all of the functionality that the span offers, you have a couple of caveats. The solar system can't be too large because it's got to fit on a 100 amp breaker if you're using the new panels, or a 90 amp breaker if it's a span 32. And you can only pair it with these batteries. So if you're looking for other batteries, you're not going to have all the functionality that the span panel offers for monitoring what's going on and some of that dynamic control that the span panel affords you. So those are some limitations and some things to be aware of before buying a span panel, or any of these products for that matter. If you buy a Leviton, it's not going to have any of the capabilities for the integration that the span panel offers. But if you buy the span panel and you don't meet the specific criteria for how you would install it as part of the span, you might not have any of those monitoring options anyway. So it's definitely good to be aware of and consider, are you really going to get all of the functionality that you're paying for with the span? And are you okay with that or not? Now, in my case, I've reached out to span a couple different times and suggested that they broaden their integration with other options. In my situation, I actually went with a Solarc inverter paired with Pites rack batteries. So again, I didn't have a lot of wall space. So it was pretty obvious I was not going to be able to do a wall mounted battery. And the rack battery options were a great option. As part of my initial install, I ended up with 40 kilowatt hours of battery storage, and I can easily double or even triple that in the future and add additional inverters for additional power should I need to do that. So having an understanding of your solar and battery and what your system might look like in the future is incredibly helpful if you're trying to get a span panel. All right, let's talk a little bit about the installation process and how the installation of a span panel can go. In my case, I used a solar installer, and that's a very common approach. Span actually has quite a bit of YouTube content out there of them teaching installers how to get authorized as an installation pro, or just kind of walking them through the benefits of pairing a span panel with a solar or battery install. So you're going to find quite a few solar or battery installers out there that are at least familiar with span, might have heard of it, might have had actual installs with it. So it's not going to be uncommon to do that. In your area, you may or may not have a span authorized installer. In my case, I think I've got one installer in my area, and I've actually had quite a few electricians into my house since getting the span panel, doing various installs or doing various upgrades and different things. And all of them have not been span installers. They all love coming to my house because I've got a very high-tech house, and they get to see a lot of really cool gadgets, and the span panel is amazing from their perspective. It's got a lot of really cool technology in it. So everybody loves to come to my house, but they're not span certified installers. And usually I tell them it's very easy to become a span certified installer. And I think they get a little bit of a markup by installing span panels. The panel itself is around $3,000. When I was looking at doing the installation, the lowest quote that I got in my area from a span authorized installer was just over $7,000 for the install. Now, pairing it with my solar installation, I was able to get that down to $6,000. But again, I used a solar installer, so I probably paid $20,000 more than it really should have cost had I just done it myself or paid somebody that wasn't a solar installer to do the work. So there is quite a bit of markup that the solar companies do charge you. And I was kind of aware of that, so it wasn't unexpected, which is why I really wanted to get the span panel done as part of the solar installation. For one thing, the add-on to mine was $6,000, like I said, so it was a little bit cheaper, but knowledge is important when you're installing a span panel. Now, I'll be honest and say, I don't think it's really that much different than doing a normal panel, but it probably does take a little bit longer, especially with the span 32, because of all the drilling and all the things that are necessary for that panel. There aren't any knockouts. So it was a lot of work. It took an installer pretty much the entire day just doing the span panel, not even talking about the solar portion of it, to get this thing installed. But for the span, if you use a solar installer, one of the things you might run into is a lack of knowledge or understanding of what the capabilities or what the constraints are for the panel. Now, for the most part, I'd already done most of the research for the span panel and kind of understood everything, but that doesn't mean that I knew everything and remembered everything when I finally did get to the process of doing the installation. I had remembered that there was reasons why I wanted to wait to get the new panel, but I couldn't remember all the specifics or all the limitations for the span panel. And the solar installation company didn't tell me about any of them. So there was a little bit of shock when we went through the installation and we found out that we couldn't land it on a breaker because of that 90 amp restriction. My solar system required at least a 100 amp breaker in order for it to land on the breaker panel, so that wasn't an option for me, which meant that I lost all the monitoring for the solar as part of the SPAN app. But I still had an Enphase system, so I could very easily open up the Enphase app and see all the information for that. But through communication with the installer, it was very clear that they did not understand what the limits or the capabilities of the SPAN panel were, which isn't surprising if it's a 30-minute course that they get for doing the installation. Now, the benefit of a 30-minute course, if you have an electrician in your area that you typically use, if they do take this course, then they're an authorized installer and you won't void your warranty. It is required that they be an authorized installer in order to not void your warranty. And they will have to call up and commission this panel as part of the process. So it'll be very obvious to SPAN that you don't have somebody that is authorized to do the installations doing it if they have to make that phone call. The other requirement is you have to buy from an authorized dealer. So it does become an issue for trying to buy this on your own. There are a couple portals out there that do list this. You might want to reach out to SPAN if you're going to use that to buy the panel in advance. You might save yourself some money doing that because there is going to be the product markup that every electrician applies to all these different products out there. So lots of things to consider about the installer portion. My biggest complaint is the lack of understanding for the capabilities, especially when I was upfront with my solar installation company about what I wanted to do in the long term of my installation process for both solar and battery. At no time did they communicate any of the limitations of the SPAN panel. Again, many of those I kind of had an understanding of, even though some of it I had actually forgotten. I did a lot of bouncing around between getting the Leviton panel and the SPAN panel. And I didn't necessarily go back and look at that in preparation for this installation. Some of the things that my installer forgot to do was to torque everything down, even though it's very clearly listed on the side of the panel what the torque requirements are for everything. At no point did they pull out a torque wrench and actually complete the torquing of the different items. Now, fortunately for me, the permit inspection for the installation of the panel failed, and when they came back, I had them torque everything down. So there was a little bit of benefit in having it permitted correctly to make sure that there was an actual inspection, and the inspector did fail it for torquing and a couple other things. Great example is a lot of the codes for older homes are no longer applicable. They've been updated, and whenever you do a main panel upgrade, you are required to bring everything up into code for certain things. For example, my house did not have grounding rods, so they had to add an additional grounding rod to get it within code. So those are some of the pitfalls of using a solar installer over an electrician. An electrician is going to make sure that everything is done properly per code under a proper permit. I've also come to the conclusion that inspectors are more strict with electricians than they are with solar installers. I've had a couple different electricians come through since getting my SPAN panel installed, as I mentioned, and they've been very quick to point out that they could not do some of the things that the solar installer did and still pass the inspection. For them, it was actually very frustrating because they're held to a higher standard, even though it's the same electrical work. Now, for the app, it is a phenomenal app. I can't really say enough good things about it. Now, it doesn't do everything. I'm going to talk a little bit in there about some of the things that it doesn't do that I would have liked it to be able to do. So as we can see, we've got our grid and what it's providing to my house. I can't see the solar because I wasn't able to land the solar in the panel. So that's, again, an example of what you lose by not being able to do that functionality. Similarly, if I'd used something like the Franklin whole home battery, I could have plugged the solar into the Franklin whole home battery, and then the Franklin connects to the SPAN, and then you get the ability to see everything as long as you set it up correctly. So that is an option also, depending on, again, the limits and the capabilities of whatever battery system you go with, whether it's Enphase, Franklin, or Tesla. This is what I was trying to illustrate with not being able to get all of the functionality depending on your specific setup and what you're trying to do. Now, with me going with a SolarArc and Pikes batteries, I will never have solar or battery in this particular app, but I will be able to see all that information, whether I look at the Enphase app or if I look at the SolarArc app, I'll be able to see a lot of the information in that as well. So you may not get all the SPAN functionality, but you still get all the really cool functions the SPAN provides, outside of just being able to see how your energy use is being done. Now, as we look at it, this is the main page. So if I scroll down here, I'll see what's using all the energy. So I can see my geothermal system is using quite a bit of energy. The geothermal system is the bulk of my daily usage. Pretty much every day, that is the number one draw. And then the water heater, I've got a heat pump water heater. I'm going to do videos on all of these different gadgets at some point in the future here. But the water heater is not too bad, and I usually see a spike, obviously, when we wake up in the morning and it needs to recoup some of that energy. But I can click on any one of these, and I can see the historical use for that item. So we can go look at the weekly, the monthly. I can view the historical for it. Now, the geothermal system is a relatively new system, so it doesn't have a lot of information, but I can kind of go back and I can look at the week, the month, and the year. Now, in the case of the year, I haven't had it that long, but I can see exactly how the usage is going to be done with that system or that particular breaker. So if we hit the back button here, we'll go back to the main page here. I can do the same thing with the water heater, but let's take a look at our lights, dining room, kitchen, laundry. And I went through and identified exactly what's on each of these breakers. It doesn't do that automatically. You have to kind of go through and figure out what's on what breaker. But if I click on this, we'll see everything that I found that was added on there. And I went through and added each one of these things on there. So for example, the electric fireplace. Now I can't click on these and see any specifics about it. I can just change what it is. I can't actually go through and see how much usage each of these items is. Again, all you're getting is breaker level viewing. You're not able to see by circuit, only by breaker, and you're not able to see by specific plug or specific run of wire. Again, you're seeing the entire breaker and what your usage is. And this is what I see as the limitation of using tandems is if you put something that has this much on there and you put two things like that together, yes, you can do that, but you now lose the ability to see exactly how each of these different circuits is performing and where your energy use is. You might see a fairly large energy use and not be able to kind of figure out exactly what's causing that drain. Now, if we go back to our other screen here, we can do the same thing for all these, and then we can also see the breakdown of specific categories here as well. And then we can come down here and see our home stats as well. Now, at the very bottom of the screen, we have the option for the circuit. So we can click on circuits, and then we can see kind of the same thing, but we can see all of the different circuits that are in there. And really what they mean by circuits, it's breakers. It's not necessarily the circuits when you're talking about 2 circuits per breaker. And then we can also look at it by area. Now, I haven't actually set up areas, but you could set up areas in your app. I didn't see the value in that just because the breakers are pretty close to the areas anyway. I've got a little bit of crossover. So for my upstairs, I've got some stuff that is on my main floor that is also controlling the upstairs. So in that regard, I don't think areas make a ton of sense in my situation. But what I really spent a lot of time on is the in panel. And if we look here, we'll see the layout of our entire span panel. Each of the different breakers will be listed in here, and then we can see exactly how much energy usage is being used at each one of those areas. And if we scroll back up to the top here, we'll also see whether it's a 15 amp, a 40 amp, a 20 amp. We'll see all of that information on here. Now, what you'll notice is that there's no way to identify your critical loads. The span panel has a critical loads feature, which works well when you have span and solar integrated in here. If your battery gets low, it can turn off all of the loads that you've said are not critical and just keep your critical loads running. Again, that will be a function that I won't be able to enjoy, but I'll still have the ability to come in here and turn things off and monitor my battery usage manually, but it's definitely not the same level of functionality that you get if you use a solar and battery combo that is compatible with the span panel. But there is no way to quickly identify which breakers are your critical loads. Now, in my case, if you look at number 5 there, lights, living room, what I did is I added an asterisk, and that was my way to visually identify, hey, this is a critical loads area, don't turn this off. And actually, if I click on 5, it won't let me turn it off. It's grayed out at the top here. We'll see that we don't have the ability to turn that off. It says control is disabled because it's a critical loads area. And the reason why number 5 is a critical loads is got to have that coffee maker. But it also allows for opening up the garage door as well. So if we go back to our other page, essentially everything on here that has an asterisk is a critical loads item. I tend to think, and what I recommended to span is there should be some sort of a visual indicator of what on your breaker layout map is a critical loads item. And ideally, I'd like the ability to turn off everything that is not a critical loads automatically. Now, again, if you had battery and solar that worked with this, it would do it automatically for you. But without that, there's no way to very quickly turn off everything that isn't a critical load. And I feel that's an oversight, especially since they are paired with such a limited number of battery options that there should really be the ability to turn everything off with a quick push of a button. And then again, turn everything back on once you've got enough battery or the grid is back on. So I feel that is an oversight, and I hope that Span will integrate that functionality in here. They've definitely done a good job of trying to make it so that you want to get one of their battery partners, but I think it's unrealistic that everybody that would want a Span panel will want to use one of those battery partners. And I think for the longevity of Span, it's in their best interest to open up to other battery options. Of course, I'm biased since I have a Solarc with a Pites battery combo. So obviously my preference is that they definitely need to open things up. Now, if we go back over to our stats here, we'll see the breakdown of the stats at the panel level. Again, we can look at it at the breaker level. This allows us to take a look at everything at the panel level. And it's a pretty good option. We can take a look at the history here. And again, in this case, I would look at the year and we can see exactly how many kilowatt hours we're using in different months. If we select this year area, and obviously in the summer months when I have got AC going, I was using a lot more energy. Now in the last couple months, I've installed the geothermal system. So we'll see if this map will actually change probably as we move into 2026 and monitor the year-over-year change based on a couple of upgrades. In earlier part of this year, I installed the heat pump. So that was an addition around February, March, April timeframe where I installed the heat pump water heater. And from a comparison perspective, I would need to take a look at my gas usage since I've replaced a gas water heater with an electric heat pump water heater and see the corresponding decrease in cost or decrease in usage on the gas side, because there definitely would be an increased usage on the electric side. And that's the same thing when we talk about geothermal. I would expect to see an increase in my electrical and a decrease in my gas usage. So these are the kinds of questions or the kinds of comparisons that you can do using a Span panel fairly easily. Now you can also download the data, and I'll actually download this data here and I'll show you what the data looks like. And this is one of those things where I think that doesn't collect enough data or doesn't have enough data shown in the app to really answer some of the questions that a person that wants a Span panel is trying to answer. And in this case, I'm just going to download to my phone. All right, let's go back to the main screen here. Now we can take a look at the feed and we can see every time that I've opened or closed the door. Again, every time I open the door, I also get a light, which helps the installers quite a bit. But it does show you a little bit of information here as far as your usage and when we turn on things or turn things off. And again, I was testing a couple of functions in here, and I'm also going to demonstrate how some of that works as well. And then if we come into the settings, we have a couple of setting options in here, but not many. And we can add home members is one of the big ones a lot of people will want to know about is, can you have more people into the app? And yes, you can. Now, the great thing about the app is you can actually go to the app and test it out yourself with a guest account. So if you want to actually see how the Span works, just go to your app store, download the Span app, and you can basically see how everything's going to work and how things look on a guest account before you even buy the Span panel. Now that is the bulk or the majority of the options that you've got inside of the Span panel app. One of the key ones though that you might be asking about is, what about the ability to turn things on and off? And that is a great option. If we come over here, and I'm going to try to pick something that doesn't really matter that much. So we'll go to the pool heater. It is a little cold right now, so we're not using our pool. I can actually turn this off with the app. And when I turn this off, what will happen is the breaker will actually stay in the on position. There'll be a click, but there won't be any power that runs through that breaker. So if you were an electrician, it might look like it's on, but if you actually put the probes on there, it'll show that there's no energy flowing through that breaker. So you can actually work on that breaker very easily without even having to toggle the switch. So let's go ahead and turn this off, and we'll see the for your safety and hit the I understand, and then all of a sudden it will be off. Now to turn it back on, it's just a matter of clicking the button and it'll turn back on. Now if you're working right next to the panel, you'll actually hear that audible click whenever it's turned on or off. All right, let's go back to the other page. And there's one other really awesome feature is the send breaker map. We can actually download the breaker map right here, and then we can print it off and add it into the panel. So you don't have to actually fill anything out with handwriting, cross things out, you go over the top of it. It will actually print the updated breaker map based off of your changes just by going into the app here. Makes for a very clean breaker map for everybody to take a look at. Now that's pretty much an overview of the app. What would I like the app to do? Now you've seen all the screens, everything is there. I'm going to show you the actual data download here shortly. But some of the things that it doesn't do for you, it doesn't actually tell you what your peak usage looks like. So I can go back to the main page here and I can see that right now I'm using 3.5 kilowatts, but I don't know what is the max. So how do I plan for an inverter? How much power do I actually need? When I'm buying a battery system, especially like a Tesla or a Franklin, how much power do I need in order to run my house? How much do I need to be able to start different loads? The app doesn't show you that, and the data that you download doesn't answer that question. It also doesn't tell you how much energy that you use at different parts of the day. So for example, if you're trying to do a battery, you might want to know how much energy you use at night so you can size your battery to account for your energy usage during the nighttime hours when solar's not running. You don't necessarily need a battery to run for your daily usage, because your daily usage, typically during the day, you use a lot more energy than you do at night when you're sleeping, depending on how your household is set up. So those are some oversights on the app that I wish it would at least answer. It doesn't necessarily need to give you the data to download, but it would be nice to know, on average, how much energy do you use at night versus how much energy do you use during the day? And then you can properly plan for a battery install or plan for the correct amount of inverter usage. For example, right now we're using 3.5 kilowatts. If I was to turn on the geothermal heat strips, that would add 15 kilowatts right there. So we'd be running at around 18 to 19 kilowatts, which exceeds the inverter that I purchased. So I would need at least 2 inverters if I was to use the heat strips. Similarly, if I was to have an EV charger, well, that's a lot of energy that an EV charger uses. One inverter is probably not going to be enough. And that might tell you how many Franklins or how many Tesla Powerwalls that you need in order to support your actual usage. Now, here's what the data export looks like from the SPAN app. And as you can see, it gives you every 2 days of data is what you're getting. So not a lot of detailed, in-depth, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day breakdown of your energy usage. And it's kind of funny. I had actually emailed SPAN and said, hey, is there a way to do X, Y, and Z with the data or to get more accurate data from the app? And they said, yes, you can get the app to give you the data. But this is only the data that I've ever been able to get. And this didn't even answer the question. So I don't think that the person that responded to my email understood kind of the ins and outs of data. I was looking for much more granular data than what this provides. But this is essentially all you get when you export it out of the app. Unless you're aware of another way to get the data, feel free to leave a comment and let me know if there's another way to get more accurate or more complete data from the app. But this is pretty much all the data that I've been able to get out of it, which doesn't answer any of the questions that I laid out as part of this video. This is good data, but it's not detailed enough to answer the questions. Now, what I could have mentioned is, yes, you could turn on heat strips and you can turn on your washer and dryer and you can just look at the app and see what your usage is. That's a great way to kind of see what an average day is. You turn your average stuff for what is kind of average for your day. So maybe for my mornings, for example, I get up and take a shower, so my heat pump's going to kick off for the water heater. And then you throw a load in the washer and the dryer simultaneously. And then you put on the coffee pot or maybe put something in the microwave. That's probably going to be your max usage for most days, not including when you turn on an EV charger or maybe the difference between heating and cooling on a geothermal HVAC system. But there's ways you can use the app to kind of answer these questions without necessarily the app giving you, hey, this is what your average is, or this is what your max is, this is kind of what your min is. I would prefer that the app do that, but there are ways you can use the app to answer some of these questions. Now, the app doesn't have a way to tell you how much energy you do at night. That is definitely not possible in there. Since I put solar in before I put in battery or some of these other things, I could use my solar app to kind of answer some of these questions. Even the Enphase app doesn't necessarily tell you how much you use at night, but it will tell you between the hours of 12 and whenever you wake up about how much energy usage that you've used up until that point. And then you can kind of estimate based off the previous day how much you used at night, add those two together, and then you've got kind of what your nighttime usage is looking like. That is the approach I use to help me determine how much battery I would need for my house and my install. And that's why I started with a 40 kilowatt system. My typical nighttime usage is right around 30 to 40 kilowatts. So I'm going to cover most of my nighttime sleeping usage. It won't cover obviously my day usage, but my first goal was to offset my nightly usage. And then the 80 to 120 kilowatts that I eventually want to get to will cover essentially an entire day to 2 days of having no power for my house. Now, one thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about the app, when you download that breaker map, it doesn't identify in the breaker map where your critical loads are either. So again, that asterisk would help with that as well as part of the process. Now, hopefully you found this content helpful. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Let me know in the comments, is there anything that I should have covered in greater depth for any aspect of this video, whether it was the span specifically or the comparison? I did do a much more thorough deep dive into the actual comparison between different products that are out there right now, even with the span 32. Since I know that I have to do an upgrade, I'm still considering whether I should switch to maybe a Leviton, a Schneider, or some of the other options that have come out since I put the span panel in there. So far, I'm still thinking that the span panel will be my next upgrade. So I will get the span panel 40 and then just use the current span panel as a sub panel. All right, that's pretty much it for today. Until next time.